Have you ever noticed cell phones made in Latin America? Are Asian businesses packing up and moving to Mexico? Some people might think these are just crazy dreams, but for Chinese manufacturers, they are serious competition. A few years ago, when China was just starting to become a global manufacturing hub, labor costs were very low. These days, though, they are much higher because they have been going up regularly for years. Because of this, it is cheaper to make things in Mexico than in China because of the cost of labor. A recent study found that the average cost of labor in China was $6.50 per hour, and in Mexico, it was $4.50. This is a 44% difference. This difference in cost can help businesses that need a lot of workers. For the last 20 years, each time you looked at where something was made, you would see the well-known Made in China stamp. That might soon change, though. Perhaps in a few years, the back of your electronics will say Made in Mexico instead. So, what's causing this possible change? Could it really make things worse for China and make Mexico look better in the world economy? Let's look into why Mexico is becoming such an important place for industry around the world. Mexico is becoming more well-known for a number of reasons. Some are affected by things happening outside of their control, such as the rising tensions between China and the US, and the problems in the supply chain caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's war in Ukraine. There are, however, some unique things about Mexico's culture and geography that are making it a major player on the world stage. More and more foreign companies and businesses are buying goods and making things in Mexico instead of China. So, what are the 4 main reasons why Mexico might become a big center for manufacturing for companies around the world instead of China? Let's look around. First, there's a really nice spot on the map for Mexico. This place is also stable when other places can't. Also, there are a lot of people working, and rates are very low. Also, don't forget that Mexico is more flexible than most other countries. For a while now, Mexico has been growing as a foe to China. However, trade between the US and Mexico goes back a long time. And that's pretty important because the US has a huge GDP, about $23.3 trillion a year, making it a world economic giant. The United States and Mexico did not have a good start to their partnership. There was a war between Mexico and the United States called the Guerra de 1847. It finished on February 2nd, 1848, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The US gave Mexico some money to make up for it, about $18 million. But in exchange, it took over Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, most of Arizona and Colorado, and parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. It's safe to say that neither side got what they wanted. After the war, the two countries didn't care much about each other at first, but soon enough, trade and business ties began to grow. From 1882 to 1910, Mexican workers were hired by US railroads to fill in when there weren't enough American workers. Part of the reason for this was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which stopped Chinese people from coming to the United States. Along the railroads in the United States in the early 1900s, more than 16,000 Mexicans worked, making up about 60% of the railway workers. So, even more than 100 years ago, the US, China, and Mexico were all involved in fights and changes in who had power. Things are very different now, but these 3 countries' economies have always been linked in some way. Many migrant workers left the United States in 1965 when a temporary worker program ended. They packed up and went back to Mexico. So, the Mexican government did the smart thing and started a big scheme to build up industries right next to the border with the United States. This was done to make it easy to move goods between the two countries. They hired a lot of low-paid Mexicans to work in places called maquiladoras, which are basically assembly shops to make things for the US market. A lot of people from the south of Mexico came to the north to work in these maquiladoras. By 1992, about 500,000 people were working, making things and services worth about $19 billion. This was about 40% of all of Mexico's exports. The Mexican Miracle was the name given to this maquiladora boom because it led to strong economic growth of 3 to 4% for almost 30 years. This economic boost made it possible for Mexico to become a big player today, taking business and contracts from China. Then, on January 1st, 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, began to work. With this deal, Mexico, the US, and Canada agreed to get rid of all taxes and levies for 15 years. It really made the US and Mexico work together more. Most economists think that NAFTA was good for economic growth because it almost tripled trade in North America. However, it did cause some social problems. NAFTA was a big reason why Mexico's economy grew and helped it get to where it is now. There's a lot going on between the US and Mexico, like their different border rules and cultural quirks, but that's another story. It's important to note that the US and Mexico have had different leaders over the years, but their trade and economic ties have stayed strong. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, took the place of NAFTA in 2020. This made the free trade deal between the three countries even stronger and longer lasting. The main reason why the US and Mexico work together is to help each other's economies. To put it simply, Mexico does well when the United States does well, and then the other way around. This setup is very important for figuring out why things are going badly for China and well for Mexico. As of 2023, the US's best trade partner is now Mexico, leaving Canada and China behind. A huge $263 billion worth of goods crossed the US-Mexico border just in the first 4 months of 2023. The United States sent $107 billion worth of goods to Mexico, and Mexico sent $157 billion worth of goods to the United States. This means that 15.4% of all trade between the US and Mexico went to Mexico, just ahead of 15.2% for Canada and 12% for China. China was still the US's biggest trade partner in 2022, but Mexico is starting to take over. That being said, why is Mexico getting more attention while China is stepping back? This is because of two main things. First, there is the continued conflict between Beijing and Washington, D.C. Even though their economies are very linked, the US and China have always been at odds with each other. Their friendship is pretty rough because they have different ideas and ways of doing things. The current trouble between China and the US is the second big reason why Mexico is becoming an economic powerhouse. The story goes that things started to go badly in 2018 when President Trump's team put taxes on goods from China. They were angry because they thought China was taking tech secrets from the United States. Because of this, China responded by putting taxes on US goods as well. Tariffs got in the way of about $335 billion worth of trade, or 66.4% of China's exports to the US. These goods had to pay more because of the trade dispute. The United States put about 19.3% of its goods into tariffs with China, and China put about 21.2% of its goods into taxes with the United States. There was less trade between the US and China because of this dispute. The US bought 8.5% less from China and sold 26.3% less to China. Because the Biden administration hasn't lowered those taxes, Mexico and Canada have jumped at the chance to trade more with the US. US companies are looking for new places to get their goods and workers since it costs more to buy from China. Because of this change, Mexico is now in a great place. The United States traded with Mexico for $68.7 billion, as Canada for $67.6 billion, and China for $46.6 billion by May 2023. Now Mexico and Canada are tied with the US in terms of trade, while China's share has dropped to 10.8%. COVID-19 really messed up trade between the US and China and made things so bad that they broke. Suddenly, everything from masks to tools was stuck in limbo as the pandemic hit. Shipping and logistics around the world became a mess. When you add this mess to the problems with tariffs and the supply chain, you have a perfect storm that could end China's reign as the most important place for production. Mexico will quickly take its place. Let's talk about how China might be tripping over its own feet before we talk about Mexico's rise and how it's getting all the attention. China was the leader in industry for years, bringing in a lot of money and investment because it was so cheap to make things there. The economy grew quickly and people became richer because of this sudden flood of cash. The bad thing? People in China started to want better wages as they got richer. In China, the average income and GDP per capita have gone through the roof in the last 20 years, making the middle class stronger and raising the quality of life. But there was a catch to this success. The cost of making the product started going up. In the past, it was easy for foreign companies to set up shop in China because it was so cheap. Not so much now. A lot of businesses are looking for cheaper places to hire workers, and Mexico is quickly becoming one of the best options. What has Mexico done to get so much attention? Learn more about how much money is coming into Mexico and how this is boosting its industry scene and economy. When it comes to investing, Mexico is really making changes around the world, especially in a few key areas. Right now, medicines, cars, and food are the big players. Companies are also interested in Mexico because it has mining rights and easy access to metals that they need. Ford, for example, is putting $260 million into a new global business and tech center in Mexico, and Volkswagen is putting almost $763 million into a new plant for electric cars. In November 2022, Economy Minister Raquel Buenrostro Sanchez said that more than 400 companies from North America are looking at Mexico as their next big move after moving from Asia. But it's not just American businesses that are leaving for Mexico. They are also moving to Mexico to take advantage of its resources and get closer to markets in North America. China put $271 million into Mexico in 2017, up from $154 million in 2016. This was because the US was threatening to put tariffs on Chinese goods. It was clear that China was drawn to Mexico because by 2021, Chinese investment had grown to $492.5 million. So, what's making Mexico grow? There are four main reasons why Mexico is becoming a global player: its position, its stable government, its large labor pool, and its ability to adapt to new situations. First, the place. Because it is so close to the US, Mexico has a big advantage over other countries when it comes to getting foreign investment. For the United States, Mexico is like having the right neighbor for making things. When the US ships things from China, it has to deal with long wait times and a lot of trouble. Now, the US can do something called nearshoring. For this to happen, trade, manufacturing, and supply lines need to be moved closer to home. The distance between China and Mexico is very short, only a hop, skip, and a jump. During and after the pandemic, there was a big push for the whole trend of nearshoring. With shipping around the world going crazy and delays lasting for ages, companies were rushing to find faster and more reliable options. A lot of goods might have been coming out of China, but it takes 15 to 30 days for a container ship to get from China to the US. Shipping was pretty much stopped during the pandemic, which put a lot of businesses in a tough spot. They had to wait months for their supplies to come. To help you understand, here's a comparison. It's a long way from Shanghai, China's largest port, to Los Angeles, California, which is where most Asian goods come into the United States. The Ford plant in Hermosillo, Sonora, Mexico, on the other hand, is only 664 miles, 1,068 kilometers, away from Los Angeles. That's not even 12 hours of driving. That means it is not only faster, but also a lot cheaper to ship goods from Mexico. Another large number of factories are spread out across Mexico, and many of them are very close to the US border. In short, it can take as little as 5 days to get goods from Mexico to the US. This makes it a no-brainer for US companies that want to cut costs and streamline their supply lines. To get goods from China to the US in just 5 days, they would have to be flown across the Pacific on a cargo plane, which is not possible for most businesses. It costs way too much. On the other hand, because Mexico is close to the US, goods can be sent there quickly and safely. Shipping from Mexico is much more likely to arrive on time than shipping from China, which can be delayed by many things, such as bad weather or a busy port. Shipping from Mexico and driving the goods right across the border is a lot safer. In spite of this, Mexico's great position helps more than just the US. The fact that Mexico is close to the US has made its policies and government more like those in Western countries. Other governments may be more ready to do business with Mexico because they share the same values. Mexico is also close to South America's growing markets, which means that goods sent there can get there faster than goods sent from Asia. Also, don't forget the World Trade Bridge, which is also called the Puente Internacional Comercio Mundial. Laredo, Texas, and Nuevo León, Mexico, are linked by this beautiful bridge. It stands out because it has 8 lines that are only for business traffic. This bridge is an important part of making trade across borders easy and quick, which makes Mexico an even more important trade partner. To put it simply, the World Trade Bridge is an important way for goods to travel between the US and Mexico. About 6,000 trucks cross this bridge every day, which makes it very easy to move and carry goods. That's right, these goods can be sold, used to make other things, or even sent to other parts of the world. Let's look at another reason why businesses might pick Mexico over China. Some companies like doing business in Mexico because they can keep a closer eye on the whole process of making and shipping their products. For example, Patagonia and other companies like it care a lot about finding sustainable materials and working with makers who put worker rights and ethical practices first. Instead of getting cotton from places like Xinjiang, China, where child and forced labor has been reported as a problem, they choose to get it from Mexico or other places with better labor standards. US companies can better keep an eye on every step of production when they have supply lines in Mexico. It works the same way for foreign businesses that want to set up shop in Mexico. In China, the government may not be as open or helpful to foreign companies. In Mexico, on the other hand, the government is more open and less likely to get in the way of investigations into investments. Because it is open and easy to get to, Mexico is a good candidate to take over as the world's top manufacturing hub from China. The fact that the US and China are still fighting and having political problems is a big reason why Mexico is becoming more famous around the world. Some experts believe that these trade disputes and taxes could help Mexico's economy grow steadily over the next 10 years or so. The UN even says that Mexico has taken about $27 billion in trade that the US and China lost. The US and many other Western countries are right to be wary of China's forceful actions and goals. The one-party rule of Xi Jinping isn't exactly how democracy countries like to do business. Mexico's government, on the other hand, is more in line with Western values, which makes it a safer place to trade and spend. China's insistence on its claims over Taiwan makes things even more tense. Taiwan is a big player in making semiconductors, which are important for many businesses. Most governments don't publicly recognize Taiwan's independence, but they still do business with it because they know it runs as a separate entity. It's possible that terrible things would happen if China invaded Taiwan and took it over. A lot of businesses are scared because an attack like this would probably lead to sanctions and maybe even war. This could mess up global supply chains and lead to blockades and embargoes that stop goods from leaving Chinese ports. This would be bad for companies that depend on Chinese goods. On the other hand, there isn't as much risk when doing business in Mexico. In terms of politics, Mexico is much more in line with Western norms than Beijing. If the worst happened and China invaded Taiwan, it's likely that companies that work with Mexico would be able to keep running normally. Because of this level of dependability, some businesses have moved their output from China to Mexico. It's possible that this is one of the main reasons why Mexico might become the world's most important industrial hub instead of China. The cost of moving all of their products back to the US and Europe is too high for them to do so. Because wages are higher and labor rules are stricter in developed economies, mass production costs a lot more than sending it to countries with cheaper labor. Because cutting costs means more money in the bank, businesses often look to countries with lower wages to make more money, even if it means taking advantage of people who are desperate for work. Every person in Mexico made about 16,049.22 pesos a month in 2021, which is about $820 USD. In the US, on the other hand, the average monthly wage was about $3,000, which is more than 3 times as much. Also, poverty and unemployment are higher in Mexico, so a lot of workers are making less than the average. In Mexico, the minimum wage is 207.44 pesos per day, which is $11.54. This means that for many workers, the real monthly pay might be closer to $230. When it comes to making, things look a little different. Mexico has factory workers who make about $3.50 an hour, which is 20 to 40% less than workers in China. Mexico's quality control is better than China's, even though their pay are lower. Moving production to Mexico can be good for businesses that aren't making complicated things like high-end gadgets. In fact, Chinese companies are moving their factories to Mexico because it has cheaper workers. For instance, a big project to build factories is going on near the small city of Salinas, Victoria, in Nuevo León. The project is called Hofusan Industrial Park, and it is being paid for by a combination between Mexico and China. Because the cost of labor is lower there, Chinese companies like Hisense, Kuka Home, Manhua, and Sunon have since opened plants there. About 44 different Asian companies set up factories in Mexico just in 2022. Foreign companies from Japan, South Korea, and the US are already there in large numbers, and this new wave of immigrants will help them even more. Wages are expected to go up as more manufacturing moves to Mexico. This will bring in even more skilled workers. In Mexico, wages are still not as high as they are in China or other places around the world. However, businesses can do more to reward their best workers. China has a very strict setting when it comes to business and manufacturing, while Mexico is much less restrictive. In China, the government is very involved in business, which can make things harder to do and make it harder for companies to run their production the way they want to. The climate in Mexico, on the other hand, is more flexible and less strict. This freedom is especially appealing to US businesses, which might be ready to pay more for supply chains that are more reliable and easy to handle. This change can be seen in the growing business ties between the US and Mexico. As Mexico's manufacturing skills grow, US companies have more and more economic reasons to buy goods and materials from Mexico. About 40% of the materials used in Mexican industry come from the US. This helps keep quality high and also makes the US economy stronger. In China, only about 4% of goods use US parts, so this level of close integration is very different. With these factors in mind, it's easy to see why Mexico is better than China. Together, the economic benefits of this closer integration and Mexico's political and logistical advantages make it a more appealing choice for US businesses that want to diversify their supply lines and make sure that delivery times are more consistent. Because of this, trade between the US and China has been going down, while Mexico's importance as a production hub keeps growing. The bottom line is that making things in Mexico is good for US businesses, the economy, and pretty much everyone in the US. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, though. Mexico has a long way to go before it can compete with China's manufacturing power. To begin, there is a big problem called graft. When it comes to crime, Mexico is only 128 out of 180, which isn't very good. That will not change until the government cleans up its act and takes down organized crime and drug gangs. Then there's the building itself. If Mexico wants to compete with China, it needs to make some major changes. Mexico doesn't have any of the 50 biggest ports in the world. There are 6 times as many ships going through the port of Manzanillo as through the ports in Los Angeles. Also, the country's roads and train systems need to be fixed up so that businesses can get their goods across the country's mountains, deserts, and dense jungles. Does that mean that Mexico will soon overtake China as the world's biggest manufacturer? Most likely not. There are many good things about Mexico, and the country's economy is growing as more businesses move their production there. But China is still a big player. It makes most of the things made in Asia and ships them all over the world. Mexico has also grown into a major player in Africa and South America, which are both huge markets. But here's the thing. China might not even care that Mexico is becoming a production powerhouse. China is looking into other business opportunities now that it's very wealthy, so it doesn't have to depend on making things to keep its economy growing. India and Vietnam make a lot of goods for companies all over the world, including China, because their labor costs are low and their supply lines work well. And while the US wants to cut ties with China, the two countries are so intertwined that it would be terrible for both of them. Still, the United States will probably depend on Mexico for industry more in the future. It could take a while, but that's where things seem to be going. China won't be leaving, though. China will still be a major economic and political force in the world, even though more businesses will likely move to Mexico to take advantage of its manufacturing-friendly laws. People in the US and Canada will likely see more labels that say "Made in Mexico" and fewer that say "Made in China." However, China will still have a strong influence all over the world. Mexico's economy will continue to grow because of its good position, stability, and cheap labor. But China's economy is also likely to keep growing.